Hello, and welcome to the virtual companion series for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, A History by Dr. Dennis C. Dickerson. In this video, I will be covering Chapter 3, Welcome to the Ransomed. This chapter covers from the year 1861, which marks the beginning of the Civil War, until 1880, which marks the end of Reconstruction. I am Dr. Christina Dickerson-Cousin, and I will be providing you with historical context to help guide your understanding of Chapter 3. The topics that I will discuss are the Civil War, Reconstruction, and westward migration. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election. He represented the Republican Party. And as you can see on this map, his support came largely from the North and the West, but none of that support came from the South. So when he won the presidential election, Southerners felt that they had been disenfranchised. Southerners were convinced that Lincoln would undermine slavery. And so on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina seceded from the Union. 6 other states in the lower South soon followed. In February 1861, representatives of these 7 seceding states formed their own nation, the Confederate States of America. They elected their own president and their own vice president. The Confederate States of America eventually produced its own constitution. This constitution was similar to the U.S. Constitution, except that it explicitly endorsed slavery. But even with all of that, even with secession, the Civil War was not inevitable. What really set the course for the war breaking out was what happened at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. In 1861, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The Union forces occupying the fort eventually surrendered, and it was this engagement, this exchange of fire, that officially began the Civil War. So the Civil War lasts from 1861, this engagement at Fort Sumter, until 1865. After Fort Sumter, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia all joined the Confederate States of America. So now all of these states are a part of the Confederate States of America. And you can see on this map, the numbers represent in what order these states joined the Confederate States of America. So you see South Carolina is first, these other states in the lower South go next, and then the states in the upper South follow. Interestingly, there were 4 slave states that remained loyal to the Union. You have Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. So all 4 of these were slave states that remained loyal to the Union. So Abraham Lincoln, in the early stages of the war, tried to keep these states happy by trying to not make the war about slavery, trying not to say, this war is about the end of slavery and we want to take your slaves away, because he wanted to keep those 4 slave states loyal to the Union. African Americans looked at the outbreak of the war as an opportunity. There was chaos throughout the South. You have, masters and the master's sons having to go off to war, and just the general chaos that ensued because of the war encouraged African Americans to really go for their freedom. So by the thousands, they escaped their masters and ran away to Union lines. And so this, over the course of years, continued to place pressure on Lincoln to act and to explicitly express that the war was about ending slavery. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. The Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in the Confederate States of America. Note that it did not free slaves in those 4 border states, or those 4 slave states that remain loyal to the Union. So again, the Emancipation Proclamation freed slaves in the Confederate States of America, but did not free those in those 4 slave states of Delaware, Missouri, Maryland, and Kentucky. African Americans were eager to fight in the war. Regardless of what politicians said, they immediately understood that this war was about slavery. And so they eagerly wanted to join up and fight on behalf of the Union and on behalf of their freedom. Nearly 180,000 black men fought in the Union military in the United States Colored Troops. They faced various forms of discrimination. So, for example, there were pay disparities between black soldiers and white soldiers. But despite all of this, they continued to fight valiantly, and their efforts helped turn the tide of the war. Black soldiers dispelled the notion that African Americans were too cowardly to fight. There was this perception that African American men were childlike and infantile and simple and cowardly, and this perception was cultivated by whites to justify the enslavement of black people, that, oh, they are too simple-minded to take care of their own affairs, so we are helping them by, being their masters. Well, black men quickly dispelled the notion that they were too cowardly or simple-minded to fight. And in fact, for their valor and their courage under fire, 25 black soldiers earned the Medal of Honor. And this map depicts the various sites in which African American men fought during the Civil War. And you can see in each of these states in the red, you see various numbers. And these numbers represent the number of black men who enlisted from each state. "14 black men served as chaplains in the United States Colored Troops, and 4 of these chaplains were African Methodists. They included David Stevens, Garland H. White, William H. Hunter, and Henry McNeil Turner. These black chaplains performed crucial roles. So not only did they conduct religious services, which you of course expect, they also performed marriages, they taught soldiers to read and write, and they visited soldiers in the hospital and helped keep morale up. So they played a very crucial role and helped to just bolster black soldiers throughout the course of the conflict, the Civil War. The Confederacy finally surrendered on April 9, 1865. So the war is finally over, the Union is victorious. And only 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln. In December 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified. So Congress recognized that although the war was over, they wanted to solidify the end of slavery. They wanted to make sure it was clear that this war was about slavery, and in order to ensure that we don't have to go down this road again, we are going to create an amendment to the Constitution to prohibit slavery. So the 13th Amendment states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So this 13th Amendment is passed shortly after the war ends, shortly after Lincoln's assassination, and formally abolished slavery in the United States. After the war ended, the United States had to find a way to come back together. The North and the South and the West had to become one country again. So Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1877, was the period in which the United States was rebuilt after the Civil War. And this rebuilding was both literal, literally rebuilding buildings, reconstituting state governments in the South, so literal rebuilding, but also figurative, finding a way to bring the country back together as one nation. During Reconstruction, Black people eagerly sought the rights and opportunities that they had been denied during slavery. They eagerly sought opportunities to acquire land, literacy, voting rights, economic independence, and freedom of independent worship. Black people also eagerly formalized their marriages. So for formerly enslaved couples who had managed to stay together, despite all of the challenges that slavery placed upon them, they were eager to rush to the courthouse and legally marry each other. So you see many inspiring examples of Black couples rushing to the courthouse to get married, to legally have their marriage and their union recognized. Also, Black people eagerly sought to restore their broken families. I discussed in the last video for Chapter 2 about the Second Middle Passage and how African Americans living in the Upper South were sold to the Lower South. Well, that was one way in which Black families were separated, but also throughout the South, masters indiscriminately sold children away from their parents, spouses away from each other, etc. And so African Americans eagerly, as soon as they became free, sought out their lost family members. One way in which African Americans sought to restore their broken families was by putting ads in various newspapers. The Christian Recorder, which was the official newspaper and still is the official newspaper of the AME Church, would publish numerous ads every week trying to assist Black people in finding their lost relatives. And AME ministers would serve as conduits between these family members who were trying to find each other. So for example, have a look at this ad from 1886, in which you have Nancy Jones trying to find her son Alan. So the ad reads, "Information wanted of my son Alan Jones. He left me before the war in Mississippi. He wrote me a letter in 1853, in which letter he said that he was sold to the highest bidder, a gentleman in Charleston, South Carolina." So here you see that he was sold away. "Nancy Jones, his mother, would like to know the whereabouts of the above named person. Any information may be sent to Reverend J. W. Turner, pastor of AME Church, Ottawa, Kansas." We don't know if Nancy ever reunited with her son, but you can see the longing and the pain hidden in this ad. And this type of ad, again, ran throughout the Christian Recorder for weeks and weeks and weeks. And other Black newspapers did the same and tried to reunite these broken families. Andrew Johnson became the president after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. So Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president. He was from Tennessee, and he was no friend to African Americans. So although Andrew Johnson had remained loyal to the Union, he did so not because he opposed slavery, but because he blamed the rich planter class for dragging poor whites into the war. So he remained loyal to the Union, he was Lincoln's vice president, but he was no friend to African Americans. So from April to December of 1865, Johnson instituted the first phase of Reconstruction. He behaved leniently towards former Confederate states and former Confederates. He essentially tried to make it very easy for Confederate states to re-enter the Union. And he did very little to support or protect newly freed Blacks. Johnson stood by as former Confederate states passed discriminatory laws against black people. These laws, known as black codes, limited the economic opportunities of former slaves and essentially tried to restore slavery, but just not call it that. So Johnson did very little to protect black people. He tried to make it very easy for Confederate states to re-enter the Union. He personally pardoned former Confederates and just showed himself to not be a friend to African Americans. In December 1865, Congress came back into session, and congressional Republicans pushed back against Johnson and this really lenient form of Reconstruction. Over the next several years, Congress passed sweeping legislation to support the freedmen. From their perspective, we just fought a bloody war for 4 years. We ended slavery because of this bloody 4 years. So we are not interested in trying to kowtow to Southerners and let them waltz back into the Union after they dragged us into this war. So congressional Republicans pushed back against Johnson and passed legislation to assist the freedmen. So we already talked about the 13th Amendment. In 1866, they passed the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. And this amendment granted citizenship to black people and gave them equal protection of the laws. The 15th Amendment passed in 1869 and was ratified in 1870 and gave voting rights to black men. Another critical piece of legislation was the Reconstruction Act of 1867. In this act, Congress said, look, we expect that these former Confederate states, if they want to rejoin the Union, they have to seriously reform and follow some basic guidelines. And until then, we are going to divide up the former Confederate states into 5 military districts, and a Union general was placed in charge of each of these districts. So you can imagine that white Southerners did not appreciate what they viewed as, an invasion by the Union, by Northerners. But for African Americans, the presence of the Union military, this was a form of protection for them, because white Southerners were not eager to give them rights. They were not eager to see them advance. So having the military present in the South helped to protect African Americans. After the passage of the Reconstruction Act, black men were able to serve as delegates to state constitutional conventions in the former Confederacy. So again, these former Confederate states had to hold constitutional conventions, create new constitutions, and have those okayed in order to re-enter the Union. So black men were able to serve as delegates to these conventions and help to shape the constitutions of these former Confederate states. In addition to this critical role, about 2,000 black men were able to hold various government offices in the South during Reconstruction. On the local level, black men served as sheriffs and police officers, justices of the peace, registrars, city council members, etc. On the state level, they served as lieutenant governors, superintendents, and state legislators. Most impressively, on the federal level, 13 black men served in the United States House of Representatives, and 2 black men served in the United States Senate, Hiram R. Revels and Blanche K. Roos. And this is an image of some of these impressive black politicians. So this gave African Americans a lot to be proud of and a lot to be excited about. They felt that, okay, maybe we really are able to make some progress. In addition to having a greater political voice, black people made great strides in education. As we know, during slavery, African Americans were not permitted to read. They were not permitted to gain any kind of knowledge. So as soon as, slavery ends, Black people rush to learn to read. In 1865, only 10% of Black people were literate, and that number climbs. In 1880, you have 30% of Blacks who were literate, and by 1910, 70% of Blacks were literate. So this just shows you how seriously Black people took education, how they viewed that as the key to a greater future, and they worked hard to become literate and become educated. The rise in literacy was due to the proliferation of Sunday schools through, various churches, including the AME Church, day schools, and historically Black colleges and universities, like Wilberforce, Fisk, Morehouse, Hampton, and Spelman. So education on the, primary school level and in higher education, they were enormous during Reconstruction. And so African Americans were able to become literate and become educated through these efforts. During Reconstruction, Blacks tried hard to acquire land. Richard Kane, who was an AME minister, noted that we must possess the soil, be owners of the land, and become independent. They recognized that acquiring land was the key to economic independence, and so Blacks tried to obtain land. But white Southerners did all they could to prevent Black land ownership. Their goal was to keep Blacks as poor farmers and poor laborers and keep them as close to slavery as possible without it legally being slavery. Few Black people had the credit or capital to buy land, so many of them turned to sharecropping. And sharecropping was the agricultural system that dominated the South after the Civil War. Essentially, white landowners made contracts with Black farmers, and in some cases, poor white farmers, and in exchange, the farmers worked a parcel of the landowner's land. In exchange, the farmer gave the landowner a share of the crop. Landowners often were the ones who gave the farmers housing, the seed they needed to plant, animals, and tools. Also, these landowners were often the merchants to whom the farmers sold their crops. So as a result, landowners and merchants, who were sometimes the same person, were able to cheat farmers and say, oh, I see you brought me this crop this year, but you really owe me this much for the animal I gave you last year. And so farmers were always ending up in debt, and this created a situation in which Black farmers were essentially relegated to this plot of land and not able to leave because they were in such deep debt. Those who were in debt were subject to imprisonment. So if you are a poor Black farmer and you end up in debt and you get thrown into jail, sometimes the state would contract out your labor and force you to work for landowners and business owners. And this was known as the convict lease system. So this is yet another way in which the southern states are able to force the labor of Black people without it formally being slavery. Southern whites were outraged by Black political participation and educational development. They used violence to oppress and control Blacks. So as you can see from the image in the back, they tried to intimidate them from voting or from voting for Republican politicians. So Southern whites destroyed Black schools, churches, homes, lodges, businesses, buildings, livestock, barns, and fences. They beat, raped, murdered, and lynched Black people, all in an effort to control and oppress them. So white vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan used this violence to try to force Black people into submission and return them to as close to a state of slavery as possible. Reconstruction ended in 1877 because of the Compromise of 1877. And this compromise came as a result of a contested presidential election in 1876. So you had Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat, running against Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican. In return for allowing Hayes to become the next president, Republicans agreed to remove federal troops from the South. So if you recall several slides ago, we talked about the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which placed federal troops in the South. So Republicans said, if you let Hayes become president, we will remove these troops. So the Southerners take this compromise, Hayes becomes president, and federal troops leave the South. Without this protection, blacks were left to the mercy of Southern whites who quickly regained political control. So this is considered the end of Reconstruction. So on the one hand, you saw great strides during Reconstruction. You saw record black political participation. You saw great strides made in education. But yet, you still have African Americans largely unable to purchase land. They are subject to violence and intimidation from white Southerners. And now, with the loss of federal protection, black people are again at the mercy of Southern whites, and Southern whites are able to reclaim political control. And so Reconstruction really ends in failure. After the demise of Reconstruction, many Southern blacks say, okay, well, maybe moving west is my best option. Staying in the South is not safe, and we have no opportunities here. So many decide to move west. So thousands of black exodusters poured into Kansas in the 1870s and 1880s. They were known as exodusters because of the Exodus story from the Bible, in which the enslaved head to the promised land where they can become free. So that is how African Americans viewed their migration to the West, these formerly enslaved people seeking their promised land. In Kansas, black migrants built all black towns and established self-government. All black towns are an aspect of black history that too few people know about. African Americans said, look, if we can't have a future in the South, not only are we going to move to the West, but we are going to establish our own towns. So Nicodemus, Kansas is one example of an all-black town. It was incorporated in 1877, and within a few years, it had over 200 residents, a bank, general stores, hotels, etc. Between 1865 and 1920, black people established more than 60 all-black towns like Nicodemus, Kansas. 50 of these towns were in Oklahoma. So you have thousands of blacks from the South migrating to Oklahoma. But there were already thousands of black people living in Oklahoma, and these were black Indians. And these black Indians were the former slaves of the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. So black migrants from the South come to Oklahoma, they interact with these black Indians, and in some cases, they work together to create all-black towns like Boley, Oklahoma. Black people continued to face violence and discrimination in the West. Still, they enjoyed opportunities that seemed impossible in the South, and so they were willing to take that risk, to migrate to the West and seek out new lives there. Black people continued their migratory ambitions throughout the 20th century, so we'll talk about later on in a future video about the Great Migration, for example. So African Americans never take their poor treatment lying down. They use their feet to go someplace new and seek out better lives for themselves and their families.